So here I am just running some 2x4s through the planer, adding a excess amount of glue and gluing them together. This will really just be used so I can make a square post, which I will then cut up into cubes. Here I'm just clamping it on a flat surface, trying to get those edges lined up. Obviously one was a fair bit longer than the other, but that didn't matter. And then clamping them together with a few scraps of wood there. Here I am just cutting the ends off, measuring its length. Now you see it's got a bit of a wobble here. Well, this is a jig that you run through the planer, and it forces one of those, it's the far edge of the post, against a straight edge. And you can see the bottom of the post, half of it's touching, half of it's not, but it is square. So I'm hammering its wedges here, holds it all in place. Give it a bit of a tap down so at least one of the sides is sitting flat. And then I will feed it through the planer again to make the top perpendicular to the side. So once I've run that a few times, I can remove these wedges that hold things in place and put them straight back on the jig board there. And you can see now, not that I have the flattest table in the world, it sits perfectly flat. Now the top right now is not flat, but of course I can run that through the planer again and make that flat. To make this square, I'm obviously feeding it through, rotating it once, 90 degrees, and then feeding it through again. I flicked the DeWalt planer over to speed 1, which just passes it through a bit slower, but you get a very nice finish. No need for sanding or anything like that. Here I'm just confirming that it's square. Yes, it's square. And it's actually very square. Now here you can actually see how much oil is in this piece of wood, which is going to haunt me forever because it absolutely stinks. So here I am, yeah, now this is when my basement was pretty dark. Now I've got an offcut of wood there, a block, and I'm using the block on its side to get the length. So the length and the width and the height are all exactly the same. So you can see here with my, I think $12 calipers, that I've got within, 0.3 or so of a millimeter in all dimensions. Now you also see that there's a chamfer on one of those edges. While it was a long post, I ran through the 4 edges, getting a chamfer, and now I have the remaining edges to do. Now you can see on this pass I actually got a bit of chip out. That's because I was trying to take off too much at once. You can see here when I change the camera angle and I take a different approach, I'm taking it in 2 passes. So here you can see I'm taking off a little bit, particularly from the trailing side, and then I can go right up against it. It's removed most of the timber already, and I was getting no more chip out. A quick sand, deburring all of these edges, and this is a good time to fast forward because it's sanding. Here's a prototype of what I made. My daughter actually made this, a bunch of cubes, and taped them all together. So a very simple jig, just holds it at 45 degrees, and I've got my drop miter saw on. I've got the stop gauge on, so it goes a particular depth, and I'm cutting this right down the very middle of the chamfer, cutting this right down the middle of the chamfer, and that looks pretty good to me. Now all of these are cut twice. They have 2 slots in them. They're not all exactly the same though. I didn't actually count how many alterations there are, but I've got a feeling that there's 4 of one type of cut and 4 of another type of cut. You can see I just run the saw over just to make sure it's good, and then I turn it on, do a very light pass, and then go down nice and slow. Tiny little bit of chip out at the back there, but nothing I'm worried about. That's how my dad taught me to use a roller brush. So you can see how oily that wood is, and I'm just painting right over it, trapping that oil in there. But yeah, no, it's just letting it out slowly. So obviously don't paint all 6 sides at once, you'll just regret it. So I think I'm painting 4 sides and then putting them down, letting them dry. Now as for hinges, it's a very complicated story why you have to use these flexible hinges, i.e. leather. This is from a leather sofa that's about 30 years old. Of course I don't go and buy leather. This is scraps that I've found. I have other leather that's from council pickup. This is real leather as opposed to genuine leather. It is very strong. It's not going to peel. It's a bit of cow, and not like a bit of 100 cows pushed together, as in genuine leather. Trademark is. Alright, so the leather slides in these slots here. Now, I did make the slots a bit too deep, and I did have to cut the leather a bit smaller because it's the last bit I have. So it doesn't actually go in the whole way. So I didn't need to cut those grooves quite as deep. So here I am, just a bit of super glue. I'm putting it on the furry side first because, well, I'm going to give that a second coat just because it can soak in a bit there. I did do a couple of tests prior to this to make sure the glue does stick to the super glue. And you'll also note that the slot really doesn't have any paint in the slot, at least down the bottom. So here I am joining this first block up to the second block, or the A block up to the B block, and in they go. And I realized straight away, oh, how do I have them aligned? Now, that did line up, but not very well. It's off by about half a millimeter. Not perfect. So I started putting together one in a jig, and then I could slide the other one in. So here I'm doing the C and D block, and now I think the E and F block, I'm not too sure, but putting them in pairs, and then joining the pairs together to make 4, and then 6, and then finally the last one. I decided to make some stencils for this. I was actually homesick these days, so I did that, very non-strenuous. Here's an example of, oh, and sorry, one of the processes I did prior to this was think of all of the words. Maybe this was the most difficult bit, making this for a particular person, a friend of mine, and thinking what words she might like. Kids was one of those, so you've got K-I-D-S. So here's just a stencil. You can see the center of the D is still in place and it's got a little tag there. I will eventually get to removing that once I tape this down. So you notice I'm putting a tiny little bit of tape where the D will go. The center of the D will go. Everything else is taped down well. And then I'm going to come along with a little bit of super glue and put it on there. Maybe it's because I don't have double-sided tape, and it's what I've got on hand, but it works very well. So the little tab that's in place, I'm just sliding under a piece of paper under here, and then using a X-Acto knife. Yes, I did find my X-Acto knife. Now it was sharp when I started this, but it's got a little bit blunt. It always misses the first notch. I'll just carve that out, but of course I got that piece of paper under there, so it's not going to scratch the wood. So I repeat that for one surface at a time, so 8 letters, and then I'm just coming along with a sponge with some very dark grey paint and sponging it. Not too wet. I don't want to go under the stencil if the paint would run, and I'm also using the knife to push down the stencil in some spots, although the sponge is quite wide and it pushes things down as well. Now I don't need this to look perfect. You can see after I've given it only one coat of white paint, I've sanded most of that off, so you can definitely see the wood through. through the paint. It's almost like a whitewash. This paint went on pretty well. Definitely it doesn't give a perfectly straight edge, which is quite good. And there are certainly some spots where you could go in and touch it up. There was one or two little accidents where it would go bleed through, and I'd either wait for the paint to dry and scratch it off, or put a little bit of white paint underneath it. You'd never really notice. So here I am peeling the masking tape off. Absolutely, total of 48 sides to this, and then this is what we're left with. You can fold this in multiple possibilities, cycle it through, yeah, and it just sits there. You can say whatever you want it to say.